Since these blockades have started to go up and protests across the country, there have been plenty of people saying, I stand with the Wet'suwet'en, I'm in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, or with First Nations in general, in opposing the pipeline project, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, or any oil and gas development at all. And I've been watching it and wondering, do they really speak with or for these people? And it turns out the answer's no. Some First Nations leaders now starting to speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, you don't speak for me. Not surprising, given that when I went through the protest in downtown Toronto last week, I saw a bunch of young university children who didn't look like they'd ever been near a reserve, never mind were from a reserve. So now we've got people from the community standing up and saying, hey, wait a minute, you protesters, you don't speak for me. I want to read you a couple of the comments from people like Marian Atill Shepherd. She said, go away, I want them to leave. That's what she said about the protesters. She said, they don't speak for me. She's one of the people from the Wet'suwet'en First Nation who says she supports this pipeline project. Then there's another woman I want to make you aware of. She is the Haisla Nation Chief Counselor, Crystal Smith. She's from the community of Kitimat. That's where this pipeline project will end. That's where the liquefied natural gas export station will be. And she says that allowing this project to go through will help her nation become independent, powerful, and prosperous. Isn't that what we want for all communities across the country? But too often First Nations communities are left with poverty, abject poverty, a lack of economic opportunity. So along comes TransCanada Pipelines, now TC Energy, and they say, hey, we're going to run a pipeline from northeastern BC to northwestern BC, and we're going to make sure that we help the communities that the pipeline runs through. $620 million in contracts awarded to Indigenous businesses along the pipeline route. $400 million for Indigenous employment set aside. That and $10 million a year for each of the First Nations communities the pipeline runs through for every year the pipeline is open. Some of these communities are very small, not a large number of inhabitants, and they're going to get $10 million a year. Imagine what that could do in terms of bringing a prosperity that the rest of us take for granted to these remote communities. When people in downtown Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal or any of these urban centers stand up and block a port, block a rail line, block a road and say, I'm doing it for the Wet'suwet'en, you have to ask, is that true? And most certainly it appears the answer is no.